Welcome. My name is Rachel Grunwald and I'm the Director of Programming at JW3. We're absolutely delighted to be able to welcome so many of you to join us this evening. I believe we've had about 1,000 registrations for this event. And I'd like to thank our partner, the Jewish News, with a special thanks to Justin Cohen and Jenny Fraser for working towards this important conversation with us. A year and a week ago, JW3 was a beautiful building on the Finchley Road in North London, full of life and argument and laughter. Today, that beautiful building houses a food bank and volunteer-run community kitchen that has distributed over 125,000 meals to local people in need. And that life, laughter and argument? Well, here we are online. And here we have been for the past year with classes, lectures, performances, debates, celebrations, and even a kids' holiday camp. And from now on and for always, JW3 will be both that wonderful physical space where everyone is welcome and this virtual space where so many tens of thousands of you have joined us over the past year. And the reason we've managed to make that leap is because we've never seen ourselves as just a building. We're on a mission. And at the heart of that mission is our desire to increase the quality, variety, and volume of Jewish conversation in London and beyond. We know that we are a community of multitudes, of richness and of diversity. We know that we risk fracture and division, and we believe that only by talking do we strengthen ourselves and build the bridges we need. So to have Yehudis Fletcher and David Baddiel agree to engage in a difficult conversation live here tonight and to consider their differences, reconcilable or otherwise, in dialogue is one of the most important things we could do. Please just let me say that tonight's event, as with so much of our online programme and the Jewish News Online, has been offered for free. If you've already supported us with a donation at the point of registration, thank you. And if you feel moved to do so at any point, please visit our website to donate or visit the Jewish News website to support them as well. This will help us continue our vital work and raising the volume of the conversations which desperately need to be aired. I'm delighted that we have in the chair tonight Henry Grunwald, OBE QC. By day a barrister, Henry has devoted himself to the service of the community. He's the perfect chair for tonight because much of that service has been spent bringing people from all corners of the community together to collaborate on issues of shared importance. Henry was the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, founder and chair of the Jewish Leadership Council, vice chair of the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust, and is now president of World Jewish Relief and chair of the National Holocaust Centre and Museum. He's still practicing law and joins us after a long day at Basildon Crown Court. It just remains for me to let you know that you can ask questions this evening by posting them in the box below your video. Please leave your name and where you're watching from so we get a sense of the community we've formed to participate in this conversation tonight. Over to you, Henry.
Rachel, thank you very much. It's a privilege to be able to chair a conversation on this topic between two so very well qualified and I hope well matched participants. I'm very conscious of the fact that JW3 has an agenda, as does Jewish News, which is to bring together disparate parts of the Jewish community. But Jewish News has been clearly exasperated at what they saw within the Charedi community during lockdown. What is the Charedi community? Well, it's the fastest growing sector of the British and indeed the international Jewish community, maybe the only growing sector within that community. And certainly in the UK, their numbers are growing to a very, very large extent. And yet they don't often interact with the mainstream community. They are different. We're going to explore tonight just how far those differences may take them and take us. But in their orthodox interpretation, they have hierarchical spiritual leaders who mediate between the religious commandments and their interpretation and implementation in practice, and rule the lives of their followers with a series of communal commitments that are not open to debate. Difference is something which is really important to us as Jews. We have thrived on different opinions, on different views, on debate through the centuries. It's kept our community live and vibrant. But is there really anything different between the traditional differences of views and what we have nowadays. Earlier this year, the Guardian newspaper ran an article entitled "Large Weddings, Packed Schools Concern as Some Charedi Jews Flout the England Lockdown." And David Baddiel, one of our participants tonight, retweeted that article accompanied by his comment of "stupid effing frummers." And that led to Jenny Fraser of Jewish News writing an article saying that his language wouldn't make Haredim more law-abiding and could paint Jews in a negative light among non-Jews. David's tweet also gave rise to what some have called a Twitter spat between him and our other guest tonight, Yehudis Fletcher, which has led eventually to this evening's conversation. David, I'm sure, is known to many of you. He's an author, comedian, and screenwriter. He's written and performed in a series of highly successful television comedy shows, including The Mary Whitehouse Experience and Baddiel and Skinner Unplanned. He's the author of 4 novels, as well as of 6 books for children, which have together sold over 1 million copies. His latest book, Jews Don't Count, has been extremely well received. David lives in London. Yehudis Fletcher is a member of the Charedi community. She is an independent sexual abuse advisor for the charity Migdal Emunah, and in 2020 she co-founded Nahamu, the UK's first think tank to tackle religious extremism in the Jewish community. She is at the moment studying social policy at Salford University, and she lives in Manchester. I'm going to ask the first question to get the conversation between the two of you going. Are there real differences between Haredi Jews and the rest of the Jewish community? And if there are those differences reconcilable? David, what do you say?
Well, I wish you'd come to Yehudis first, because one of the key things about me in this conversation, I was very interested to take part in this conversation because I spoke what you called a Twitter spat between me and Yehudis, which by my standards was so not a spat. We carried it on a little bit on direct message, and that's why I'm doing this, because what Yehudis said about the Haredi community and their status for other Jews was really interesting to me. So even though I am one of the 2 participants in this conversation, as regards the details of like how do the Haredi community differ from the mainstream Jewish community, I would just have to defer to Yehudis about why don't I stop talking and let Yehudis answer that, and then maybe I'll come back and react to what she says.
Well, after your answer, Yehudis, we'll go back to David and see if he thinks that those differences are actually reconcilable. Over to you.
Thank you. I, as a Haredi Jew, never opted out of being part of the Jewish community. I don't count us as different. Everybody lives their lives differently. Lots of people have different values. Lots of people have just different family circumstances. And certainly within our Jewish community, there are different cultures. But as a Haredi Jew, I never opted out. And I don't like the framing of mainstream Jewish community versus the Haredi community. Certainly there are differences in the way that different people live their lives. But if you go, further round northwest London and all the way up to Aberdeen, you'll find different Jews living their lives in different ways. I think it's artificial. I don't like the binary in or out. You're either mainstream Jewish or you're Haredi Jewish. Are those differences, as far as they do exist, reconcilable? Of course they are. As a persecuted minority, I think we should learn to get along between ourselves.
I agree with that insofar as I, understand it. We might as well talk about the tweet, because that's sort of what's brought us here. The first thing I would say is I'm not interested, and I don't think Yehudis is in having a big row about it. But I can tell you what my thinking is, which perhaps is useful. So I am an atheist. I think I obviously identify and very interested in being Jewish as an identity and as an ethnic minority and as a cultural identity. And obviously, the book Jews Don't Count is about, you know, the struggle within the conversation about anti-racism to have Jewishness recognized as a thing that gets discriminated against and that is a really genuine, legitimate identity. One of the things I'm very clear about is that for me, the religion is nearly an irrelevance within that. In fact, not just an irrelevance, but a red herring, insofar as a lot of non-Jews, when they think about anti-Semitism, think it's a type of religious intolerance and thus downgrade it as being less important than racism. I get this all the time on social media. If I talk about racism against Jews, I get told by people it's not racism because Jewishness is a religion. And I point out, no, I'm an atheist and the Gestapo would have shot me on sight. You know, neo-Nazis don't ask if you keep kosher before they set light to your house. That's why it's racism. So that's a really important sort of structural point in my argument. Now, that isn't to dismiss religious people, but they are dismissed in terms of my argument within that book, I would say. So on another structure of my thinking, I am, you know, I disparage religion. I've done it a lot in many things I've done. In lots of comedy I've been mocking about all sorts of religion. And I would definitely include Orthodox Judaism within that. So in terms of that tweet, I read that thing from The Guardian as this is a religious sect within my own community, but a religious sect that is doing religious practices that I really do not believe in, and that seem in this that I would normally ignore. I mean, it's fine, you know, you can be as religious as you like. But as far as I understood the news story, those religious practices were leading to an increase in COVID-19 and the spread of COVID-19. I think we all know that within the Haredi community, there is a very high level of the spread of COVID-19. And as far as I understand, and Yehudis can correct me, that is partly because they pay no attention to the lockdown laws and carry on having, you know, big congregations and big weddings and all that kind of stuff. And for me, the ability to say this is stupid, this really shouldn't be happening, and I express myself more robustly than that, but that is essentially what I'm saying with the word stupid effing from us, should totally be allowed. Jenny Fraser saying this might create a sense of like things are not great with Jews amongst the non-Jews is entirely why I would think you should be allowed to say that, because that notion that Jews never criticize their own is one that we should really dispense with, and we should be absolutely okay to criticize our own. Jews don't count does not mean Jews never criticize each other, and the book is slightly a critique as well as progressives of other Jews. And the reason I use the word frumers, which is really key, is that I was signaling to anyone who reads that I am Jewish. That I'm Jewish and I'm criticizing these people because I do recognize kinship with them. I did not say stupid effing religious Jews. Frumers is a Jewish word and it says I am Jewish. I don't approve of these people flouting lockdown and therefore spreading a disease. So that's why I did it. And then Yehudis said some things to me about the status of sorry, I've been talking very deep, but the status of the Haredi community within the mainstream Jewish community that made me think, oh, I need to complexify how I think about that. And that's sort of what I'd like her to talk about a bit more, if that's possible.
Yehudis, is it right that you suggested to David that his book really ought to be called Frumers Don't Count?
No. I suggested that tonight's event should be called Frumers Don't Count.
So come back on what David has been saying. And can you also deal with something that I'm sure everyone watching tonight will have views about, which is the question of the so-called flouting of lockdown laws? Okay.
Well, you'll have to remind me if I forget to address that, because there's about 14 different points that I need to come back on to David. If I can start in the middle, Jenny Fraser's worry that criticizing frumers or Haredi Jewry would invite anti-Semitism. I disagree with that. We're not responsible for other people's bigotry.
Yeah.
Bigots are responsible for their bigotry. In fact, if anybody is going to criticize what can or does happen within Charedi Jewry, it's me. I am our own biggest critic. So I am, that's not something that I would agree with at all. We absolutely should and must be able to examine our own behavior. We need to be accountable both to the state and also to the free press. That's important that we are open to scrutiny. It's the only way to ensure that we flourish as a community. So I don't have a problem with the criticism. I have a problem with the framing of an entire community as one. There is no religious imperative to flout, and I don't like the use of that term either. I know it's being used very, very widely, but it has certain connotations. But just, there's no religious obligation to flout COVID laws. It doesn't come from a religious, it's not coming from a religious position. There are cultural issues within the Charedi community and within some Charedi communities, because the Charedi community is far from homogenous, that encourages certain behaviors. These are long and complex, and maybe we can explore them a little bit deeper, but I want to get to the end of this answer. But nobody is coming from a perspective that says, from a Jewish values perspective, we need to break the law. That's not what's going on. There are all sorts of reasons, ranging from the way people live, the way people's lives have been conducted up until now, where people send their children to school, what people do for a living, that meant that adapting to lockdown was different from the way other people might have adapted to lockdown. And that has certainly had an enormous impact on the amount of deaths within, we had some huge numbers out of the ONS. I think it was just yesterday that compared figures in Hackney almost street by street. And you can see the differences just within Hackney of where Charedi Jews are living and where sort of hipsters are living. And you can see the differences in the numbers there. So I'm not denying the impact that COVID has had on the community, but it's certainly not due to any kind of religious position. It's to do with the way people live their lives. And I'm not saying that the decision that's like good decision making. And I'm not saying that there are certainly harmful cultural religious practices that are being pushed by people in positions of power. But that doesn't mean that people at the bottom of that power pyramid have as much privilege as you might expect them to have if you're just going to sort of swipe them away with stupid effing frummers. What you alluded to, David, and what I'll expand on a little bit is when I think about anti-Semitism, I think of Jews as an outer class. So Jews not really fitting into the class system, whether it's within Britain or around the world. And then within the Jewish world, kind of acting as a microcosm of that, from people or Charedi Jewry also fitting that kind of framing. So Jews as an outer class within the outside world, and then Haredim as an outer class within Jewish society as well. So we also don't quite fit in. There's, from a socioeconomic perspective, you might consider that we're worse off. You might think from an education perspective, certainly from a secular education perspective, we're not, there's not a lot of professionals, there's not a lot of higher education. There's an enormous amount of poverty. There are very large families. And just thinking of the positioning within the community, that's sort of where we fit. Now, we're also seen as very much, as in the same way as Jews are othered in wider society, Haredim are othered within Jewish society. In the same way that you were able, David, your thinking allowed you to say, well, also, stupid effing frummers, because, and I'm not judging you for that, but that's where you came to in your mind when you saw that article. I think I've never been a non-Jewish anti-Semite, so I don't know how one might think, but I would assume that often that's also coming from a place of not quite understanding and not necessarily from a place of absolute malice. But I
don't agree with that. Sorry, okay. yeah, the book that I've just written has unearthed, and I kind of knew anyway, that there's an awful lot of unknowing anti-Semitism. And so you have, although it depends, I guess it's just the phrase implies to me of being an anti-Semite. I don't think there's any non-malicious anti-Semites. There is unconscious anti-Semitism, which I think is very different. And I'm totally prepared to accept that me saying that involved me not understanding, the lineaments of that community. I would still say, judging on what you've just said, that I would say the same thing, but I would apply it to those practices that you're talking about. It sounds to me like, yes, there are many, many people within that community. I mean, this might be the wrong word or whatever, but that feel to me like, they have no choice but to live in certain circumstances that might lead them to have no ability to think differently or to act differently to prevent the spread of COVID. The practices that are imposed on them by the powerful, because there must be powerful people within that community, they are being stupid. I'm sorry, 100%. There's no other way around it.
And that's not something we disagree on at all. They're not only stupid, but they're harmful and they're abusive.
Right. Well, I mean, people who don't know, Yehudis also is campaigning at the moment about forced marriage within the Orthodox community, which, I've listened to her talk on Woman's Hour, where, interestingly, considering the many different angles in which the Jewish community can disagree, she was being argued with by a member of the Haredi community, just as I am tonight. But, it sounds to me like there are very medieval attitudes going on within that community, and that is really what I'm talking about. I totally agree that it might have seemed like I was just saying everyone who exists in that community is an idiot, and that is unfair. And I hold my hand up, but really, I am talking about the practices that exist within that community. In a way, that's what I mean by frummas. I mean religiousness. I mean religiousness in itself. Now, so can I just talk about something very specific? You've probably seen, or you may, I don't know if you have seen, but Adil Ray and Mira Sayal did a video reaching out to members of the Muslim community and other members of the brown community who also have closed communities and aren't that great with vaccination and with dealing with COVID regulations or whatever. And I saw that and I commented on it. And then NHS people, actually Adil got in touch with me, but NHS people got in touch with me. And I had a conversation with someone responsible for putting that video together who said, well, we'd like to do something similar for the Jewish community, for the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, because the COVID rates are incredibly high with that community. And then they said, but more than any other community, they won't listen. They won't listen. And I said, they won't listen to me. There's no way. And, I think I suggested to someone, I don't know who it will be. So I think the chief rabbi's name came up. And again, someone said that's like getting the Pope to speak to anyone who might change the attitudes of the Haredi community as regards, proper social distancing and vaccination or whatever else it might be that is not being, held to within that community. So that is what I'm talking about. And you're right. Stupid effing frummas suggests people, and it suggests the whole community. And I apologize because that's wrong. But I absolutely stand by the idea that this disease kills people. Its spread needs to be contained as much as possible, and practices go on to that community that continue that bad practice. And I am being told by NHS people they won't listen, and that is really stupid.
Yeah, sorry, go on.
No, I was going to say I think that you both put your fingers on something which may be an irreconcilable difference between and Yehudis, forgive me for using the frame again, but between the Haredi community and I say the mainstream community, let's say other parts of the Jewish community. Because in the other parts of the Jewish community, your rabbi may be very important, but his word is not necessarily law in the way that it is within the Haredi community. So the Rav of a particular part of the Haredi community has the ability to tell his followers, his members, what to do, and they will do it. And perhaps that really is a big difference between the Haredim and the rest of the Jewish community.
So there's a concept called Das Torah, which means kind of surrendering your will. It's a Jewish concept. There's a history to it. And it's surrendering your will to somebody who's kind of meant to, got the wisdom of Torah behind them and is going to know better, and relying on them to give you advice. And seen in its narrowest form, this is basically coming to an expert in Jewish law for advice on Jewish law. One of the things that's happened more recently is this kind of expansion of that concept to really grotesque proportions, where people really rely on outside advice, so from a rabbi of their own community or the rebbe of an entire sect, to tell them whether or not to have an operation. So not to give them a blessing that an operation will go well, but to say, should I have a cesarean or something like that, sometimes when it's really time sensitive. And that is something, David, that I would call a really stupid practice. You don't call up a rabbi and ask him if you should have a medical operation. You can call up a rabbi and say, I need a medical operation. Can you pray for me? Or I'm scared. Can you comfort me? So certainly I would agree with you that there are really, really harmful practices, and forced marriage is something that I've been campaigning on recently. But that needs to be seen in the wider context of everything else that's happened between Charedim and other Jews. We have been abandoned by the rest of the Jewish community. We have been entirely othered. There is a racism of low expectations that is applied to us, where it just, this is normal for us, the discourse of normal for them, where, if our children don't get an education, or if our children won't be able to support themselves when they grow up, or if our children are going to have to fraudulently claim benefits whilst working cash in hand, and everybody turns a blind eye. Why? Because we need that sort of shtetl to exist for us. We want, or there are certainly people who want that kind of what looks like authentic Judaism to be able to call on it as and when they want, to bris the babies and to bury people when they die. But in the meantime, what happens to the actual children, to the vulnerable people, to the internal minorities within Haredi communities? Are people really that bothered?
Can I ask a question? Well, just before we do that, I noticed that Justin Cohen from Jewish News has said the take up of vaccine, he said that in the private chat, in the Haredi community is very high. The reason why such a video isn't needed. That's not quite correct. I mean, it might be correct that the take up of vaccine is very high. At the point in time that I was being asked by the NHS if there was anything that could be done, it was more about the lack of social distancing, and the flouting of other regulations, congregation and all the rest of it. It was more of a video that might try and engage with, a possibility that community might listen and not do those things than about the vaccine, I think. And that was definitely needed. I was being told by the NHS that video, someone telling them, I said it's no good, it being me, but something like that I think was needed. Can I ask a religious question of you, which is, I remember when I went to the Northwest London Jewish Day School, an Orthodox Jewish school in Northwest London, we were taught that any Jewish law can be got out of in a life-threatening situation. So, if you need to save someone's life by doing something on Shabbat that you're not meant to do on Shabbat, like, in a modern world, drive them to hospital, you can do that because a life-threatening situation overrides, religious law, normal religious laws. So why does that not apply with things like social distancing?
Of course it applies. Why do you think that the people who are so-called flouting the laws, it's not for religious reasons. They're not flouting them for religious reasons. They're flouting them because there is a culture that's a ghettoized culture that's been allowed to flourish, and it's a closed system. It's sort of gone rotten inside in many ways because there's been no oxygen let in. But
I don't understand. Sorry, Yehudis, I literally don't understand. Are you saying that the reports that say very large weddings and congregations for prayer, those aren't the reasons? It's just the ghettoizing. So
no. The ghettoizing includes gathering for prayer. Nobody's gathering for prayer because that's what God wants them to do. They're gathering for prayer because that's the way they've always lived, and that's the way and to stop doing that would mean stopping the outsourcing of morality, would mean actually stopping and thinking and critically analyzing what they're doing.
That, but you're talking like an atheist now.
I'm not an atheist. I'm a Charedi Jew.
No, but that's what I think. Of course, that's what I think. Of course, I think that all forms of organized religion are essentially hypnosis of how people will just behave, because that's the way they've always behaved.
No, that's not a criticism of organized. I'm not criticizing organized religion. What I'm saying is what we have when people start risking their lives in order to daven with a minion is stupidity. That's what the Torah, that's what we call a chosed shoita, which means a stupid chosed, actually.
But you are, I mean, we are
that's what the Talmud has a name for people who behave like that.
Okay,
that's
so
and I'm not giving you a no true Scot. This is not no true Scotsman. I'm just telling you the reality. Stamford Hill is full of people who are not from.
But they do all the from stuff.
But how are you?
No, I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing. I want to understand.
Yes.
You know, I mean, we are so. To be honest with you, we are so close in the way that we agree here, because you are essentially saying there are a bunch of people in Stamford Hill who are stupid, partly because they are not obeying what you would see as
behaving stupidly.
Yeah, they're behaving stupidly or whatever, in a way that is endangering the spread of COVID, causing greater spread of COVID. And it's not even properly religious, you're saying.
It's certainly, it's not at all. It's not a religious impetus that's driving this. It's a fear that if we stop doing this very, very orchestrated, very ritualistic, sort of worshipful, I guess we could call it, way of living, where everything is dictated and everything is done within a really, really narrow space, we might actually have to start making, first of all, people might start making changes and choices for themselves. And
you've just described organized religion. That's what you've done. You've described all organized religion.
Well, I'll tell you the difference. I'll tell you the difference between organized religion and what I've described. Within organized religion, there is a Jewish concept that's called bechira chofshis, free choice. And Judaism needs free choice is the oxygen for religious Judaism. You cannot take credit for doing a mitzvah or doing a good deed or observing Shabbos or whatever it is, or visiting the sick or being a good person, if somebody held a gun to your head and said, you must go and visit that sick person immediately, right? So free choice is fundamental to the concept that you will reap rewards in the world to come, or reap rewards on this world, or whatever you're going to believe. But the idea that you can somehow have a version of Judaism where you have no autonomy within your life is nonsensical. It's not Judaism. It's some kind of perversion of Judaism.
Okay. I mean, I still think the gun is in your head a lot of the time with religion. You know, it might be outside your head as well, but it's definitely inside your head. Religious people. What you know? I know. You know, my friend Frank Skinner is a religious Catholic, and he once had, I won't go into it now, but a very complex thing about how, you know, he couldn't take communion because he was split up from his wife and the church didn't recognize divorce. He was sleeping with someone else, so he couldn't take communion, blah, blah, blah. And eventually I said to him, this was very early on in our relationship, sorry, why are you worried about all this? And he said, no, you don't understand. I think I will burn in hellfire because of this. And he meant it absolutely seriously. That is a gun to his head, inside his head. It's his choice, but religion has inculcated it within him. And there's no question that's what religion does anyway. So I'm sure there are rabbis within the community that are oppressive and, you know, forcing people to do stuff. But I wonder how many people even understand it as a choice, as you're saying it.
Well, I think there are many people who understand the concept of bechira chofshis. It was taught to me as a child, and I'm not unusual. Whether or not we then go sort of much further than that and really kind of create such a fear, there are, I mean, my mother's on this call, so thank you, Mummy. I was brought up with that kind of dealing with that in my head, but certainly encouraged not to observe out of fear. And there are two ways in which we can practice our Judaism. We can practice out of love because it's something that we want to do and gain benefit from and seek to enjoy. and we can practice because we think there's going to be fire and brimstone if we don't. And I prefer the former. And I know there's some people who might engage in the latter. I don't think.
I wonder how easy it is to separate psychologically some of the time, because, you know, I mean, Judaism is complex because it doesn't have the obvious afterlife, obvious heaven and hell, whatever, but it does have an enormous amount of regulation. And I've often felt that it has something, and please don't take this the wrong way, but this is what I felt, particularly when I went to an Orthodox school where I had to do all this stuff, that there's something OCD about it, about like just constantly having to do things to make you feel okay. And interestingly, Shalom Auslander, who you may know of, Shalom Auslander.
Yeah,
okay. So Shalom Auslander, who was brought up in a community very similar to yours in America, when he left it, which was a struggle for him, but when he left it, he talks about all the time, because he's not doing the stuff, he thinks something terrible will happen to him. Constantly thinks his wife will die, constantly thinks his child will die, because he's not doing all the stuff. Again, that is an internal gun to your head. It's just been inculcated within him. And I do think all religion does that.
Well,
can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
If you're right about I suppose it's the power structure that makes people behave in the way that they do. Is there any way that within Charedi communities, if that power structure were removed or eased, what would happen to people? Would they continue to observe in the way that they do you think? Or would this concept of freer will rather than pure free will, what effect would that have on them?
So I think for some people, it would bring joy and satisfaction to their Judaism, which might at the moment be more fueled by fear. And for some people, they'd be having bacon sandwiches on Yom Kippur morning, because there is an after effect that comes from having things shoved down your throat without that love, satisfaction and enjoyment, where you're constantly sort of worried that if you don't do the next right thing, you've completely failed at being a good person. That makes that when that kind of vice is released, that you're like, right, well, I'm not going to do any of this. First of all, I've got post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's a real thing for people who do leave the Charedi community who suffer from symptoms like that. I'm certainly not everyone, but there are definitely people who are traumatized by extreme religious observance, and the way that they've been impacted by that when they decide to leave or stop observing is that they will just abandon absolutely everything. And I'll never judge someone else's trauma, but I think for me, I have come to a kind of psychological shift myself, where I've been able to release some of the parts of observance that felt really, really oppressive to me, and yet still not feel like I had to choose between being safe and staying in my community. And
how are you seen within that community?
Well, there are certainly people who don't like me. It threatens the narrative that you're either in or out. It threatens the very binary narrative that people in power like to hold on to. So as I've said before, I'm not threatening to leave, I'm threatening to stay.
Were you, I mean, it sounds like you obviously got a really good relationship with your mum who brought you up in this community. So presumably you were never subject to the idea of forced marriage.
I don't normally comment publicly about my own, marriage, but I have lots of personal. I mean, I'm from a big family. I've lived in the Charedi community all my life. I grew up what's called Litvish, which is of Lithuanian extraction, and when I got married, I married into Satma, which is much further to the right, if you want to call it that. So I have lots of lived experiences of the things that I talk about.
Yeah, no, I wasn't questioning that at all. Yeah. I just, in a way, I was sort of wondering how you get to your independence of mind, because obviously you have that. And that's one of the things that you're saying is that, you shouldn't see this community as a homogenous community. And you're a sort of shining example of that, because you clearly think in ways that are very independent and original that a lot of people in that community don't. That would be fair to say, yeah?
Well, I think I'm not as unique as people think I am. I have lots of besides for personal relationships, I was trawling through some stuff online yesterday, and I came across this 15-page thread on a Charedi mothers, like the equivalent of a Mumsnet, but from mothers. 15 pages on did you have a forced marriage or not? There was a conversation that was spurred by the position paper that I co-wrote with Eve Sachs. And these are Charedi women, Hasidic, non-Hasidic, discussing the very concepts that I'm raising now, not necessarily all agreeing, many of whom said, yes, they did have a forced marriage, but that was language that didn't exist before and is now being discussed. So I think if I can engage in some thought leadership, sometimes I am leading from the front, but I'm pushing at an open door. People don't want to be subjected to a hierarchical sort of power structure. People want to live. We're just normal people. We want the same things you want. We want equality. We want freedom. We want to bring up our children to have opportunities, and we want joy.
But how can it change in terms of, like, let's talk specifically about the thing that we're rather than forced marriage, the thing that we're here to talk about in a way, which is, I see this news depiction, which no doubt is simplistic, suggesting that the imposition of certain religious practices within Stamford Hill are leading to a failure to contain COVID, right? How does that change? If the problem is there are rabbis basically who are saying, no, we're having a big minyan or more than a minyan or whatever it is, and we're having a marriage and we're having whatever else it is, and no one is sitting 10 yards away from anyone else because that's not how we do things. That is stupid, right? We all agree that is stupid.
That is very stupid.
Then how does it change in terms of you sort of saying, but there are lots of people who think differently? How does that change?
Well, at the risk of sounding like Tony Blair, education. There's no other way to progress as a community, to be sustainable as a community with our education system in the state that it is. It's not acceptable that our boys don't have any secular education past their bar mitzvah. It's not acceptable that our girls do phenomenally well at GCSEs and then hardly any of them go on to sit A levels. It's not okay. And it leads to people sort of in my position. I'm 33. I've got 3 young children, and I'm at university now. I think maybe if I'd already done one degree and then decided I wanted to do another one now, that would be one thing. But I'm on the back foot, and I don't think that's a position we should be putting certainly not a position I would be putting my children into.
Sorry, what then would be your definition of a Charedi Jew?
Oh, you have to come to my Limud talk. I have a Limud talk on who is a Charedi Jew. A Charedi Jew, from my perspective, needs to be seen through a class lens. What's in my invisible knapsack? And my invisible knapsack is, rich, really rich with heritage, good Jewish education, little to no secular education. My mother's an English teacher, and she used to sit me down at the kitchen table and have me write essays on poems she gave me, but that's my unique circumstances. Most people don't have those opportunities. That for me, that is what a Charedi Jew is. It's somebody who has the incredible benefits, but also the significant difficulties that come along with coming from our particular set of socioeconomic circumstances. Now, you can argue that to be Charedi is an ideology. You certainly can make that argument, but most things are an ideology and something else at the same time.
Okay. David, you told us that you went to Northwest London Jewish Day School, a traditional Orthodox primary school. Has it left a lasting impression on you? Has it made its mark on you?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that, for most Jews I know, and, I now hesitate to use the word mainstream because Yehudis has correctly said it won't be a binary thing. But, most of the secular Jews that I know who are a larger part of the community, and this is part of the problem with trying to explain anti-Semitism in books like mine to people who think they're anti-racist or whatever, is that it's an elusive identity, Jewishness. I mean, all religious and cultural identities are more elusive than I think the white mainstream would understand them to be, but certainly Jewishness is quite elusive. And so, for example, I was going to that school and I had sit and a couple, and I was learning Hebrew and I was eating kosher at the school, but I was having bacon sandwiches at home because my dad's an atheist and he liked bacon sandwiches. And then as soon as I was out of that school, I very quickly thought, I don't believe in any of this. I mean, I think I had a bit of trauma myself, tiny compared to the kind of thing we're talking about. But I enrolled myself at Hader for about 2 weeks before I thought this is really boring, and decided not to do that anymore. But I think I had a moment of thinking, it's not. The world is not Jewish, and that's a bit shocking because I've been in this very Jewish bubble for a long time. But my point is that I think it's, in terms of what did it leave me with, is I think that Jewish identity is very multiformed, and part of it is religion. Even though I'm an atheist, insofar as I still do Pesach, and we're doing a bit of a Seder here, and I'm going to a Zoom one. But for me, that is nothing to do with God. It's nothing to do with my sense that there is a God who is listening to any of that. It's because I did it when I was a kid, and it's nostalgic for me, and it's part of who I am, and it's part of like the history of being Jews. That Jews have done this ceremony for years, and my identity is being Jewish. I mean, one of the things I've noticed about being an atheist is, and I really hesitate to use the word celebrity, but I can't think of another word for it. There's a bunch of people who are like celebrity atheists, right? Ricky Gervais and people like that, Richard Dawkins, if you like, whatever. And I would, as a person who is an atheist, I'm about the only one I can think of who is from an ethnic minority. And as such, I have a different attitude to it. In fact, I think I have a more fundamentalist disbelief in the actual existence of God than any of those people. I have a very, very, very stone cold disbelief in the existence of anything supernatural. But I actually think that religion and, the sort of power and lyricism and magic and lessons that you can get in religion when it's not some of the sort of terrible, corrupt things that we've been discussing tonight is actually kind of useful. And I certainly think you can't understand what it means to be human unless you understand what religion is and what it's doing for people psychologically. So all that is really complicated.
But it gave you a very strong moral sense?
No.
No?
No. I don't know if I have that. What you've just said. Many of my friends would say I don't in some ways. I have a very strong sense of truth. That's basically my only moral sense. I'm obsessed with truth and obsessed with being true at all times. Normal ideas of good and bad, I'm not that interested in most of the time. I don't think I got it from there. No, I think my sense of who I am came from my parents. It came from my reading. It came from just my life experience. I can't think of a moment where I look back to anything I learnt in Hebrew classes at that school or whatever that informs how I think at a very deep level. But it does inform it at a sort of non-intellectual level, a sort of emotional level, I think.
Okay.
Can I jump in if that's cool. Okay?
Please.
So, David, the way that you describe your Judaism is something that's not necessarily it doesn't give you anything intellectual. It's something that you enjoy for the nice parts, and it's also that really actually matches the way many people who live one of these kind of extreme, you could call it extreme Charedi lifestyles, would also absolutely agree with. It's a way of life for people. It's something that people enjoy doing, and for many people in the Charedi community, it's the only way of life that they've ever lived. So if your entire life has been regimented in a way that it's not just that you go and daven with a minyan 3 times a day, but that's your entire social system, right? You don't use social media, although there are many, many, many from people on social media. If you don't use social media and your whole social capital is tied up in meeting your mates 3 times a day, and the whole cycle of your life is communal rather than, and that's not to say that non-Haredi people don't have communal lifestyles, but Charedi people live an extremely communal lifestyle, meeting 3 times a day. In terms of even just how you buy your groceries, more likely to shop locally, more likely to rely on sort of second-tier, third-sector organizations rather than statutory organizations for welfare needs. To make a leap away from that kind of communal living is just another level that other people haven't had to go to.
Yeah, you accused David before of othering Charedim in what he had said in his tweet, but don't Charedim other the rest of the Jewish community?
Yes, certainly many people in the Charedi community do, and that's really stoked from right at the top of the power pyramid. It's often kind of used as a way to justify why must you stay in this very small space with these very tall walls around you, because out there it's dangerous, and if you leave you'll become a prostitute and addicted to drugs, and everybody out there has no morals whatsoever. That's certainly a narrative that is put out to try and keep people in. I reject that narrative. I think my religion and my morality needs to be strong enough that it's not threatened by other people living a slightly different or even a very different lifestyle.
Yeah. David, have you felt othered by the Charedi community since what they may have seen as an attack on you, on them by you?
No, but I mean, this is I don't know enough about the differences between different different Orthodox Jews, but I would say, and really this is again true of any religious thing, is that it is part and parcel of being religious that you are once probably in a secular world, you feel put upon and othered and looked down upon and patronized by the sort of secular humanist way of being. But at the same time, most religious people I know, and I think probably the few religious Jews I know, obviously do have a sense that I am going to whatever hell exists in their version of the world. Yeah, I mean, clearly religion gives you something. I mean, I totally agree with Yehudis that lots of people are just in that situation and know no different, and so may not have this feeling of superiority. But I do, I've certainly felt that. I mean, I'll tell you something. So let me tell you a story. So, because I talk about on stage, I talk about the story about how I think most Jews are atheists in some strange way. That certainly because there's no concept of the afterlife, no clear concept of it, and Judaism seems to me like much less obviously like that than Christianity is or whatever. So I said this anyway. I do this gag, but it's a true story about how all Jews seem to be atheists in one sort or another, and more interested in food and culture than they are in God. And then one day I got phoned up by the rabbi. This is true, who seemed very frum. I don't know who he was. He phoned me up. He said, "Can you light the menorah? I want you to light the menorah that we've got on. I think it's on Whitestone Pond in Hampstead. They had a menorah for Hanukkah, electric menorah. We want you to switch it on." And I didn't really want to do that. I just didn't. So I played my trump card. I said, "I'm sorry, Rabbi, I'm an atheist." He said, "So am I." And I thought, blimey, I have underestimated the level of atheism within the Orthodox Jewish community. But I'll tell you something else about him. And this is a little bit what I sometimes feel with religious people and maybe with religious Jews. He just phoned me up and didn't say like, "Hello, David. Look, I really think this is I'm sure this is an imposition, but look, I'm really sorry. But would you mind?" No, it was literally, "Hello, David. I'm the rabbi. Will you light the menorah?" And it was a slight sense of, obviously you're going to do this because obviously that's the godly thing to do. And so that was partly why I said no, because there wasn't that normal human sense of interaction. It was just, I am speaking from on high. You're supposed to do this. And obviously, Yehudis, there'll be loads of people who aren't like that. But that was what I picked up from this man. So, then I felt a bit othered.
Yehudis, are there any atheist Charedim?
Of course there are. Of course there are.
Yes.
First of all, there are atheist Charedim. Secondly, there are loads and loads of Charedim who occupy quite senior positions in the power pyramid that I was talking about, who go off and do all sorts on their holidays. Most of what people are doing in their day-to-day life, in what is seen or what is portrayed in the media as the Haredi community, is a culture that people subscribe to. And it's not fueled by religious zeal. And also, David, to your rabbi who sounded like he was speaking on high, I congratulate you on being spoken to by a man who was full of himself. They speak to me all the time.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure they do. I'm sure they do. I mean, that's the thing, is there does seem to be like an absolute, and obviously this does apply to all religion at a high level and the power structure of religion, but there's just no doubt. That's the thing, is I think that the mark of, intellectual complexity and understanding is doubt. That's how you begin. Like, I might be wrong. I might have things to learn. The truth is always complex. So whatever I've said, including what I said then, I think, I would now adjust how I would say that and my meaning of it. And that's the rest of it. That's my approach. Don't get that from high religious people. They have no doubt.
I think maybe they don't admit to their doubt. I think somebody who doesn't have doubts has stopped growing.
Yeah.
Difference is something which we've spoken a lot about tonight. And difference is important, isn't it? I mean, we are all different, whether it's in our religious observance, the level of that observance, or the way we live our lives. And ought we not to be able to respect difference in other people? Because I get the impression, David, that you may not.
No, it depends what you mean by I don't intellectually respect a blind belief in God. No, I don't. I don't condemn a person for it, and I would completely agree with Yehudis that within the strictures that have been set up by powerful men within that community, there may be no other way of thinking about stuff except blind obedience. And I have sympathy for that and think it needs to be understood in the way that Yehudis is talking. But in terms of intellectual respect, no, I look for a kind of original and independent ways of thought, such as Yehudis is showing here, but not in terms of the way that sometimes religious people think. So I completely respect difference, but I need the person that is talking to me to show that they have thought differently for me to find that respect.
Okay, so can I respond to two things on two levels? David, there's just everybody's entitled to their own personal boundaries. You don't owe anyone conversation and engagement. That doesn't mean you don't respect them as a human and as a citizen of this country and as a Jew. I think those are two very different things. I don't think you're saying you disrespect someone because you disagree with the way they think, and you also don't need to go around lighting anyone's menorahs if you don't want to. You're perfectly entitled to set your own boundaries wherever you want to set them.
I do need to be told that.
The right not to light. I think that's a very important right. The right not to light. The right not to light.
Right not to light the menorahs. Yes, I mean, don't get me wrong. Obviously, I respect everyone's right to think however they like. I'm just saying that I personally, would look for real proper, in terms of, no, I don't have to engage with anyone, but I like to engage with people. I'm enjoying engaging with you, but that is partly because you have ways of thinking that are enlightening to me and that make me think, okay, I haven't really considered that. This is a really original way of looking at this matter, etc., etc. Whereas a lot of the time, and you'll have come up against it a lot, you come up against people who are just saying things that are blindly ascribing to a belief system that you don't have respect for.
Or perpetrating real human rights abuses. And that's where I'm going to say, what do I respect absolutely everyone? I reserve the right to wholly condemn human rights abuses that are perpetrated within my community. And I do not need to respect the frameworks that allow them to continue. And I don't need to respect people in positions of power who uphold them. And I can choose not to engage with them in the same way as I've said to David. But I absolutely respect people on an individual level. Everybody is deserving of respect, even if they have different beliefs to you, even if they, I can't tell you what it's like to be the most visible type of Jew and to fear walking down the street and to be self-conscious going into a public space that if you make a scene, everybody's going to know it's a Jewish person who made a scene. If you complain in, if you complain in a public environment, people are going to say, oh, it's a Jewish person complaining. Whereas somebody who doesn't look quite as Jewish might get, might get away with it, or might not be picked up on that they're Jewish. But if it's somebody who's wearing what we call the shmoina begodim, the 8 garments that make one identifiable as a Hasidic Jew in particular, Hasidic Jews are the most identifiable Jews and bear the sharpest brunt of anti-Semitism in the public spaces. Okay. And I think we ought to recognize that.
We've had a number of questions and we've got a little time remaining, and I'd like you both to answer 2 or 3 of them if we have time. Questions come in from someone who says they're working with the Charedi community on the census, and on a visit to Stamford Hill on Sunday, this person was the only one wearing a mask in a crowded shop except for the servers. What can be done to change that attitude?
Is this a question?
It's going to have to be Yehudis, because I don't know the answer to that.
It may be Yehudis.
I do. I have 3 answers to that. Education, education, education.
Okay.
But people aren't listening, though, Yehudis.
No, it's not. You can't come in during a pandemic, in a public health crisis, and expect to flip a switch and suddenly everyone's going to believe in science that you've allowed an education system to continue for 30 years without. And suddenly everybody's going to start listening to the government when we've spent the past 10 years telling everyone how evil the government is and Ofsted's out there to get you and all that stuff. And suddenly you expect Public Health England to be able to go in and people are going to listen. How is the ordinary man on the street expected to code switch in that way? Nobody cared when we were suffering internally, when our children were not receiving an education, when our women and young people being forced into marriage, when our children, sexual abusers, were having a field day because nobody's allowed to report them to police. Nobody cares when that's happening. And suddenly we become a danger to the rest of the community. And I don't just mean the Jewish community. And now people want us to start suddenly now we're supposed to start complying.
But can I just interrupt with that? Just one thing about all that. I mean, as far as I understand it, which is not very much, all that stuff, I don't know whether no one cared about it. The sense that I get is that within that closed community, attempts to, do something about that, like attempts to tell them how, they need to take COVID seriously and they do need to listen to science, are ignored, at least by the powerful people, and the powerful people have a stranglehold on it.
No,
that doesn't mean that no one else cares.
No, that's a pattern that's been allowed to develop over time. The establishment within the Jewish community have always known that these problems were growing and growing and growing. And, we've been, there was a news night, I think almost 10 years ago now, about the lack of secular education for boys in Stamford Hill, where the then president of the Board of Deputies was interviewed. And it's not a new problem.
But sorry, look, again, I have no truck with the Board of Deputies, but if NHS are saying to me, there literally is no one we know we could make a video about social distancing and about mask wearing that this community will listen to outside of the community, and no one inside the community wants to make such a video, what is to be done?
First of all, NHS England don't understand, well, certainly young Jewish people, because young Jewish men in particular love comedy and they'd love a video by you.
All right.
There's
okay.
the answer.
Well, I'll do it then. Then I'll do it. I mean, if it was to be listened to, I'll do it.
What I'm saying is we've now reached this boiling point, but it didn't begin here. It didn't begin at this point where people's lives were at risk.
Okay. Final questions. They're really part of the same one. David, do you think that there's anything that other Jews can learn from the Haredi community? A positive lesson that can be learned from?
Well, I certainly think we can learn from Yehudis. It's an absolute education listening to her talk about this, because many things I didn't really know about, and there's a complexity to the community, as there is with all communities. But it feels very closed from the outside. It feels like, okay, this is a very closed community, and you sort of do assume, and this is wrong, that everyone thinks in a very uniform way within that community, and it's all probably incredibly obedient and subservient, and they just follow the laws in a way that is, not helpful at this moment in time. So it's not that within that. I mean, that is happening, but clearly there are distinct and individual and dissenting voices within that. So that may not be the answer to your question, but I've learned that tonight, and I think that's a useful thing to learn, because it's always useful to see humanity as a collection of individuals rather than en masse, as a homogeneous mass. In terms of what I could learn from, as it were, the orthodox strictures, the orthodox teachings of the Haredi community, I still don't know, to be honest. And I would say that, though, you could ask me the same thing about the Catholic Church. I mean, I don't know what I could learn from that either.
I'll resist the temptation to do that, but I will ask Yehudis, do you think that there are things that other Jews can learn from Haredim?
Yeah, of course. There's incredible entrepreneurship within the community. Men managing to earn a living despite not having received a secular education. Women battling with strictures that other women haven't had to face since the 70s or 80s, and still managing to step out and proud and live incredible, joyful lives. My own family are warm and loving and still haven't thrown me out. There's in the same way as other people are complex, we are complex too. And I'm not saying we're the community that's right. All I'm saying is that we're a community made up of individuals, and we're people, and we ought to be treated as individuals.
So look, I want to thank you both very much for what's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. David, I don't know if it's right or not, but I was told that when you were asked if you do this evening, you said, maybe to Yehudis, that you weren't going to do this with any old frummer. It would have to be her.
Yeah.
Now, even if you didn't say it,
no, I didn't say that.
And if you did, that's even better, because I think it shows that two people from very, very different standpoints can actually find things not only to respect and understand in each other, but to like in each other and to learn from each other. And I hope that you've both learned from each other, as we've all had the privilege of learning from you. So I want to thank you on behalf of everyone watching tonight for your having given of your time for this really not just informative, but entertaining evening. And I'm going to hand back to Rachel to wind up. I just want to say a thank you both to Jewish News and to JW3 for having facilitated this. And finally, to wish everybody watching a very happy, and as the traditional saying goes, a very happy and a kosher Pesach. Rachel, back to you.
Thank you, Henry, Yehudis and David, for that gripping conversation. And thank you all for joining us from Glasgow, Cornwall and Sweden, according to the questions, and for participating. Conversation is at the heart of culture, and we renew and strengthen it every time we talk in this way. We hope that you'll join us again in future. If you're interested in politics, you might like to hear Ian Lucas talk about the Israeli elections next Tuesday. If you're human and have a heart, I guarantee you'll love our next event in partnership with the Jewish News, celebrating Fiddler at 50 on April the 11th. And if you're interested in Jews, news, or religion in general, then our Exploring Beliefs, Religion in the Media seminar with keynote speaker Rowan Williams on the 12th of April is right up your street. You can find out about these events and hundreds more, including the first back in our beautiful building this spring, by signing up to receive our newsletter. And you can help us do all this and more by supporting us in a number of ways, joining our Friends scheme, spreading the word to your friends, or trying something new with us. There is lots to try. I'd like to end once again by thanking our speakers, our partners, the Jewish News, and by wishing you all a happy Pesach. When we started, startled, to do our first online events at this time last year, we didn't imagine we'd face a second Pesach apart, missing those hugs and arguments and spilled glasses of wine. But at least this time, when we meditate on freedom, we have a roadmap. I like to think of it as a Finchley roadmap towards liberation. So Chag Pesach Sameach, and next year in each other's houses. Good night.